Hello, everyone, and welcome to How to Approach Threat Exposure Management in a Quantitative Way. I'm Kate Keene, and I am the head of Global Cyber Advocacy at Worldwide Technology, and also the CISO in residence for the National Technology Security Coalition. I am really excited about this session today because, as we know, cyber threat is everywhere, and how organizations approach measuring and managing threats and the regulations and budgets associated with that can be complex. This session, we're going to delve into what is threat exposure management and why is applying quantitative techniques for management so important. We're going to hear from some of the leading experts in this space on what are the main challenges and best practices we should consider when translating technical risk to financial terms. With that, I'd love to introduce our panel. So why don't we get started with that? Ruby, would you like to introduce yourself?
Of course, thank you very much, Kate. So I'm Ruby Aronashvili. I'm the founder and the CEO in Cy. My early days, I was in the Israeli army, working in cybersecurity in different aspects of the Israeli military. Then in 2012, I founded Cy, and since then working as the CEO of the company. Happy to be here. I'm sure that we are going to have a very interesting session today.
Ira, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi. I'm Ira Winkler. CISO at Cy. I began my career at the National Security Agency and was there for a while. I ended up going ahead and leaving NSA and working for government contractors, then industry. I'll just leave it that over the years, I was chief security strategist at HP, chief security architect at Walmart. Now I landed at a wonderful company called CyberSecurity, where I can actually put my money where my mouth is, for lack of a better term, when I've said that the problem with CISOs is they get the budgets they deserve, not the budgets they need, and they need to learn to deserve what they need. So that's why I'm here.
I'm sure we're going to have a jolly conversation about that, Ira. But before we dig into that, I would like to have our featured guest introduce himself. Cody, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Yes, thank you. Hi, folks. Cody Scott, Senior Analyst at Forrester. Previously, I used to be the Chief Cyber Risk Officer at NASA, did that for about 9 years, then came over to Forrester to cover all things related to cybersecurity and IT risk, including control monitoring, all things GRC, and the relationship between IT and enterprise risk management. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being a part of this. So in the session today, we have a couple of objectives. The first is to really understand what is quantitative threat exposure management and why is it so important. Second is to obtain a clear understanding of the potential impacts that could be related to cyber threat and how can we actually think about them in a more quantitative way. Third, we're going to learn techniques that really translate to the technical risks in financial terms. And four, we're going to learn how to build better trust and transparency with our stakeholders. But to level set, I think it's really important about the introduction to quantitative threat exposure management and really giving an overview of some of the traditional versus the quantitative approaches. Ira and Ruby, can I start with you guys? What are we talking about here? Why is this important?
Ira, do you want to start?
I'll let Ruby go on that.
You're not going to jump first, Ira? Oh my goodness, this is a shock.
No.
It's just warming up, So, so, when it comes to decision making, right, one of the things that we always say that a data-driven approach, and that's something that is general, right, not only in cybersecurity, a data-driven approach is always something that is preferred in order to be able to get smarter decisions. Now, when it comes to cybersecurity and risk management, the qualitative approach that brings you some kind of, critical, high, medium, low kind of severity analysis is definitely not good enough these days in order to be able first to know where your risk is. So from level perspective, is it like 100 million, is it critical? 5 million, is it high? Being able to compare different assets, different capabilities in the organizations will be extremely important. And second, being able to quantify also the investment, and above all, maybe something that is very strange to cybersecurity, return on investment. That's something that definitely needs to be taken into consideration when it comes to quantitative measures. Now, in order to be able to make those smart decisions, saying which elements are at risk, what is the level of risk, what's the likelihood for that to happen? Again, a lot of interesting discussions here. Likelihood of a breach, that's something that, can we really predict that? That's something that we will discuss today, obviously. But being able to say This is the likelihood. This is the impact. That's the exposure associated with that. And that's how much I'm going to invest in order to reduce or mitigate the risk. That's why you need quantitative capabilities to be able really to answer those questions and to communicate it, by the way, to the relevant stakeholders.
Yeah,
I think
and let
there's
me
an,
actually,
oh, Ira, you
oh,
go ahead.
okay. Well, I was going to add to it because the reason I didn't want to go first is because you required what I perceive to be a, more of a definition, like clear cut. I I define it this way and less formal. And how I define it is basically what I see as a problem in cybersecurity is that CISOs are making decisions based upon their gut. And they're in that position because they have a good experience, they have a good gut feeling as far as looking at different things and what should they do. Unfortunately, that gut feel is kind of right most of the time, but it's not exact. In other disciplines, people are actually making decisions based purely on the numbers. And in cybersecurity, we have not been able to do that. And with quantitative threat exposure management, we can take the gut feelings away and actually make scientific, numeric based decisions, which is critical because, I mean, as you've seen, for example, in incidents where you have good natured CISOs and very experienced CISOs making decisions that frankly didn't necessarily match the threat, didn't match things when you look at it in hindsight. And unfortunately, we saw a little bit of that with CrowdStrike. We see a little bit of that with different types of environments. And I'll leave it at that for now, but this is why I think it's critical. We got to start making business-based decisions like every other discipline in a business.
So it's interesting you say that because I'm going to take it a step further. I always looked at it, and from a quantitative exposure perspective, as zones. I had the zone of routine. What was going to keep the lights on? What was the mandatory base level of cyber we had in the organization that I could directly correlate to the bottom line of the company? If we don't have this, this is going to happen. If we don't have this supply chain is going to fall down and it's 5 million a day. Like those kinds of direct correlations of base level. Then you had the zone of surprise, which was, okay, these are the things that caught us across the eyes this year. We had a ransomware attack. We had a phishing attack that led to this type of data loss. Our lead competitor had X. Here was a result Y. How do we take those surprises and operationalize them into the zone of routine? Then I had the zone of catastrophe, and those were the black swans, the things that you don't necessarily anticipate, but you're paying attention to because of either geopolitical type of a scenario or there's been some type of cat breach. What should we be learning from them? And do we pull that down into the zone of routine? What I see, though, from a quantitative perspective, as you start to look at threat exposure management, is I'm starting to see a bit of a loggerhead and a disconnect between the C suite and the board and the CISO, as far as now you have regulatory compliance issues that are at an area and a level we haven't even seen before. And now we've got the Chevron reversal on that as well. Then you have the question of, is what the CISO's agenda matching to the key performance business indicators of the board? Is what the board wants the organization to do and achieve being supported correctly by the security posture of the company? And do they even understand each other? And so that really starts to dig into what metrics should organizations be focusing on? How should we be measuring either the key performance areas of a business and how it relates to cyber, probability of threat exposure in those areas, damage? And Cody, this is an area I think you work on a lot within your research. So I'd really love your opinion on what should we be measuring? Because I joke all the time with Ira that this is a dark art. And then you get insurance in the middle of it, and we can go down that rabbit hole later. But I'd like your opinion on this.
Yeah, and well, I love this question because, when I was at NASA before Forrester, I had kind of a breaking point, right? So we were collecting a lot of cybersecurity risks. We were working across the entire agency. We sat at the agency office for overseeing all of the IT risk. And there was one day where we gathered all of this information. We had, it was kind of self-assessments. A lot of it was very qualitative, heat map driven kind of assessments back then. And we got to a point where we were presenting our findings to the CIO and saying, here are all of the top risks and here are our ratings and why. And the CIO looked at it and said, that's great, but I can't convince the head of the agency that these are as significant as you're saying that they are. Because when we compare this to the rest of the risks that the agency has across all of the other kind of mission areas that NASA has, do these IT risks really rise to that level of what we would say a 5 would be or something like that? And it was kind of like a brain breaking moment where there's a little bit of frustration. You're just like, well, what do you want from me? Like, what do you expect? Like, what are we supposed to do? But then you step back and you say, okay, yes, I understand the point here because this is not normalized data. And in fact, this is not data driven in any way. It's very driven on the kind of qualitative field that we put in place for how we would determine the IT impact, but it's completely devoid of the rest of the mission areas. No buy-in whatsoever to help characterize that, no way of coming up with a common assessment. And when I hit that point, I said, hold on, we need to step back and we really need to focus on just the measurement itself. So that fundamentally, that's kind of how I got into quantitative risk management to begin with. But then going into the metric side of exposure, this is really interesting because there's not really a one size fits all approach for every single organization. However, something that you can do, and what I've worked on and what I help a lot of organizations work on, is to try and decompose risk into the different variables that constitute how a risk scenario unfolds. So when you start to look at that, Kate, you mentioned some of the things, likelihood, impact, overall exposure. We can break that down further and we can start to say, okay, assets, are the number of assets in our environment increasing or decreasing? What kinds of assets are there? What kinds of vulnerabilities do we have? How significant are those vulnerabilities? What are the threat actors? Is our capability to detect threats increasing or decreasing? Do we have the right controls in place to ensure that we have that kind of visibility? And then do we have anything that's telling us how effective our processes actually are once a threat event is detected in some way? So what is that? And that looks different for every organization, but getting down and asking that question, asking how risk unfolds, what are the elements of risk? What are the things that I care about most in my environment? That's a really good stepping stone to defining sort of the metric library that you would put in place. So exactly those kinds of things that we were talking about, looking at the top attack vectors in your organization, looking at what your most critical assets are, measuring those things. But the one thing that I see a lot with security practitioners is that they forget about the control side of this. So talk to your GRC teams. Don't forget about the mitigating controls that are in place, because often those should be considered as part of the picture for understanding your total risk exposure and threat exposure. And when you do that, you can come up with those appropriate metrics.
Yeah.
I, I love
Kate, could I?
it.
Uh, Go
Ira, you
ahead.
and I are going to do this whole webinar. So I'm just going to pause and give Ira his rebuttal time. Ira, go for it.
So I'm gonna have to say what Cody said, but we need to take it to the next level. And let me tell you why it requires a change of thought process. In other disciplines, again, I look at a COO, they make they don't go ahead and say, hey, well, what's important? They do, but they put a dollar figure to it. They look at what is the outage. They look at what is an outage cost. Unlike, for example, like trying not to mention my past employers who were awesome, but there was a dollar figure to how much an outage actually cost, what was acceptable, what was not acceptable. Now, these days, and where we're going to start to see a benefit from why cyber threat exposure in a quantified way is now possible, is that we now are collecting lots of data. And with the lots of data, we can now make use of machine learning, AI, other mathematical formulas that were not previously there, or I shouldn't say not previously, that were previously there, but not practical to implement because we didn't have the processing power. We didn't have the computing power to take all the big data and put it through complicated mathematical formulas, which essentially these, in a grand scheme, it's machine learning, whatever you want to call it, and other things. And now we can kind of take this, put this together, and tune these models so that we can do what other business disciplines do and create a financial impact. Because yes, we do want to say what keeps the business up and running. But why is that important? Why it's important is it involves money for the organization. And what's the impact and so on. And we're now able, with better math, better processing capabilities, we're able to take big data and actually start not just to make, like I said, decisions from the gut, guessing, well, this is important, that's kind of important, and so on, but making it financial. And I'll leave it for that and let Kate disagree with me now.
I'm going to actually disagree with you. How did you know that was going to happen? It's amazing. Um, Here's the thing. I agree with you on the sense that there is a lot of math and big data that's going to help us. And Cody, I like how you put that transfer from qualitative to quantitative. But here's the problem. I don't think, and going to be very blunt for a second, I'm not sure that it's going to fix stupid on the short term. And here's what I mean by that. So, working with organizations, I hear a lot, well, Kate, we're looking at the heat map and we've hired, this massive big firm to do our heat map from a threat exposure perspective. Here's all the qualitative data based on our, industry and this and that and the sun, moon, and stars, and this is what our map's supposed to be. But what they're not taking into account is here's the strategic business objectives. They're expanding into Kuala Lumpur. They all of a sudden are working a lot more in Eastern Europe. They have a new facility on the West Coast. Whatever those things are, that can actually, if you think about the threat actors and the criticality for the business, maybe they're hooking 20% of new growth into Asian expansion, or, a 15% recoup on a existing investment by going further into the West Coast. Whatever that is, that's a very quantitative type of a number that can be leveraged from a threat perspective. If you mirror that and say, okay, in APAC, an organization like yours faces, a 50% increase in hacktivist activity, you should be changing your heat map from, your threat map from focusing on ransomware to focusing more over here. That's where all of a sudden you don't see organizations doing that, where you take the actual business risk, whatever the digital opportunities they're trying to achieve, and marrying it to, in essence, the accepted standard of qualitative approach. That's what sometimes gets me a little nutty of how we transfer on that. So, Ira, to your point, I love the amount of big data and what AI is going to do to help simplify, but we're approaching it with the wrong questions to begin with. And so it's changing that dialogue between the C-suite and board and the risk executive that's almost got to come first as we start to think about this from a quantitative threat exposure perspective. But I'm going to ask Ruby a question now for a second, because Ruby, you are on the front lines of working with customers day in and day out on these types of issues. What do you think are some of the main challenges organizations face when transitioning from what Cody is talking about, from the qualitative to quantitative approach? And Cody, I'd love your perspective too, as what you see, as an analyst, on what are some of the things that we should be helping guide our customers and our friends through.
Yeah. So I can start by saying that maybe the most obvious thing that we see is data. And let me explain, right? First question that you get is, where do I get the data from? What type of data is relevant? Is it external industry-based data, which is of course important, maybe to get the quantitative, let's say, landscape? Then what type of internal data, organizational data, is important from telemetry perspective? What do I need to collect? How that is actually being taken into consideration? What's the ratio of the different elements? Which one should maybe impact or affect the specific measurement more? Those are questions that we hear quite a lot, and we see organizations actually struggling with how to do that. And more than that, when you talk about, and you mentioned, for example, APAC kind of assessment when it comes to the risk and what happens, for example, in the US and then in Europe, when you compare those. So being able to be sensitive to different parameters, that geolocation is one of them. Industry is second, but in general, the different business units in the organization might have different types of risk level and definitely a different type of threat landscape. Those are all questions that need to be taken into consideration. So today the heat map that you've mentioned before is something that is, again, I think it's really nice because organizations learn how to work with that, but it definitely doesn't answer the questions that we hear today in board meetings. And let me give you some of the top questions that we hear. Number one question being, from my point of view, maybe the most popular, is how do I know that my cybersecurity program is efficient or good enough? How do I know that I'm covering the right elements? So trying to answer those questions with qualitative capabilities will be very difficult. So the translation to those quantitative elements that, as I mentioned before, the struggle is around data, but not only data, is how do you really keep the emphasis on those KPIs or business objectives that we know that the board and management, executive management, will search for. And to me, that's a process that is very hard to do in or within an organization, because sometimes the knowledge that is outside of the organization is really, really hard to get, right? So to give you one example, when we started getting for example, the cost of breach data, as you know, right, from your previous roles, that's one of the maybe most difficult things to get in the industry. That's very hard to get this data. How do you quantify your potential risk? How do you predict that if you don't have the data? I'm not even talking about the likelihood analysis, which is much harder even, right? To be able to get the relevant parameters to measure in order to be able to do some kind of, in a way, it's predictive analysis, right? You're trying to get a very clear understanding of how an attacker will get into the organization and actually implement or exploit some kind of chain of vulnerabilities in order to get to a significant impact. So to be able to do that, maybe the wrap up of my answer is you need the right data in the relevant balance between the different data items, and definitely ignore the data that is not relevant, right? So that's maybe one of the most important things that I can say. Everyone talks about big data. I would say small and effective data will be much more relevant in this case.
So you're going to start the campaign for small data. Cody, I've watched you go like this
Small and
entire
effective.
minutes. I think you have something you want to add to this.
I love this conversation, and I am a proponent of this new kind of, the small data. I like that a lot. I think when I work with a lot of organizations, there's a couple of what I would call misconceptions that come up. Number one, quantitative risk assessment is too hard. I think that's something that we hear a lot. It sounds very fundamental, but really it does hold a lot of organizations back. I work with a lot of Fortune 500 enterprise organizations who have this exact thing. They have a need. They know that quantitative risk management could help them. They know that that data would be valuable, but they perceive it to be so insurmountable to get to that point where they themselves can not only just collect the data and do the assessment, but then actually translate that output into something that their peers and their organizations would trust. That's a really big hill to climb if you don't have a lot of confidence in quantitative analysis or even understanding, the fundamentals of it. Fortunately, that's something that can be solved with education. But the second component, when you start to peel back those layers, it does come back to the data. And it's not just the sense of, what data can I collect? What data do I trust? That's a huge component of it. And fortunately, the quality of data has been improving substantially. A lot of great industry resources out there. You can use data that is not just relevant to your company or historical data from your company. You can use approximation because why? Statistical models outperform people in the majority of cases, which means that we can actually trust those outputs a little bit better. But the other thing with data is really when I talk to people about data, it's a conversation about trust. So do my peers trust the data? Does my board trust the output? Can I convince people that this is worthwhile? And do I even trust the output? Does that range even seem relevant to me when I'm looking at those numbers, like the likelihood of a breach given a particular scenario, or that overall picture of risk exposure given a particular scenario or threat event that occurs? Very hard to do if you don't have those fundamentals, but those are kind of the two big challenges that I see when I talk to organizations. The other thing, I do have to throw this in here because I call it out in my research all the time, but confusing quantitative with just anything else. Like when we talk about quantitative risk, We are talking about probabilistically modeling the output of a risk scenario. We're not predicting the future. We're not putting hard estimates in and saying that this is definitely going to happen. We're using a relative assessment that tells us, based on the given data that we have, what we could expect given that these factors come to play. There's a lot of misnomers out there, especially when you get into things like risk scoring or risk ratings. Those are often conflated with quantitative risk analysis. And just because the word quant is there, it's doing it a disservice almost, because I think a lot of folks have a fundamental misunderstanding of what quantitative means. That's another thing that you can kind of get over, but that's something that I feel like on the end user side, when I work with a lot of organizations, we do have to spend a lot of time working with them to kind of backpedal and help them understand that, a risk score over here for that thing that you did a year ago is not actually what we're talking about when we're saying that we're doing a quantitative assessment of a risk scenario in your environment, or a quantitative assessment of the likelihood of ransomware or the impact of ransomware in some case. You saying that it's a 5x5, score dark red on your heat map, very different than talking about the range of probable loss over a given period of time.
It's interesting
So
that you it's
just one
interesting that
point.
you talk about the use of analysis, because I use bow tie analysis a lot when I'm looking at different AI risks and thinking about it from a quantitative standpoint. And to your point, it's a question of really containerizing what is the threat, what is the opportunity, what is the data necessary to get to specifically that almost tunnel vision answer, because it'll boil the ocean if you think about it. It's interesting because we just had a question come in, and Ira, I'm going to poke you on this, and it was about, they're listening to our audience is listening to us talk a lot about the emphasis on data. And one thing I think Ira and I would agree on is that the CISO drowns in data to some degree. There's data on what's happening from an environment health standpoint, what's actually trying to attack us. Are our employees doing what they need to do on a daily basis? What are the attempted logins? Everything. There is so much data. So the question is, so what you're asking us is, with a new quantitative approach, is the CISO going to have to translate and understand more data? And I don't think that's necessarily the case. I don't think we're asking the CISO to handle more data. I think it's more about, how do you ensure the accuracy and reliability of the data, and what is the right data to use in quantitative analysis? And Ira, as a veteran in this area, what's the answer to that? How do you ensure accuracy, and what are some of those best practices?
What I think we need to do is we need to look at, the thing is, there's a lot of data there and they do need to understand it, but what they need is the right data. There's big data and there's little data. And sorry, my dog just goes crazy. I don't.
Is there medium data too? Like, should we make pink data, blue data? I think we could have all types of data.
Yeah.
I'm going to riff until your dog stops barking.
No, he's stopped now. So what happened is, because the problem is, when you look at all this data, the key is that there's only certain things that actually matter. And before, where we were disagreeing, we don't really have as much of a disagreement as you think, because, and especially like the big data versus little data, it's a matter of using the formulas to figure out which is the right data to look at. Because at the end of the day, there's a few pieces of data which are truly indicative of the problems that they face. And having big data allows people with the right tools, tuning of algorithms, to find the data that actually matters. And I'm not saying, but I think, frankly, and I mentioned AI, I think 99% of people implement AI wrong, as a buzzword, in the wrong situations with the wrong formulas. However, when it's handled right, and to answer your question, we help people identify what is the data that actually matters, and help them figure out how to make better use of that data. Because quantitative and between qualitative, people think, oh, qualitative means I'm looking at a few pieces of data that really matter. Quantitative means I'm making big decisions. It's like, or I'm looking at lots of stuff. No, quantitative, when used in the right way, what I think we're all talking about here is, quantitative data means we're taking actual numbers, and more specifically, the right numbers, and to Ruby's point, little data, and using the little data mathematically in the right way. And by helping CISOs find that little data that Ruby implied and helping them figure out how to interpret that data, I think they can make better decisions because, when you look at things like attack path visualization, just as one example, I think is incredible for CISOs to look at because when you look at Log4j, I'll use that as a quick example. Log4j was the scourge of the internet for a long time. And I can unfortunately tell you it's actually irrelevant, but I can tell you that just about any major company of size has probably tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of instances of Log4j still on their network. However, when you're able to go ahead and say, hey, wait a second, but when we look at attack paths and look at potentially mitigating controls, that's okay because we can take a mitigating control and render neutral all the instances of log4j that are there until we could get back around to fix them. Now, I think I answered your question in one way or another, but again,
I'm
hopefully.
going to pick on you a bit. So, Log4j, I'm going to go with the obvious one, which was, most organizations didn't realize Log4j was going to be an issue until Log4j was an issue. So it's
Mhm.
hard to model a threat we don't know exists at the moment before it exists. So I'm going to ask you, to kind of break down for the layman. If I'm looking and listening to this webinar, the first step in going from qualitative to quantitative is an agreement on what threats you should model, correct? Right?
Yeah,
Understand?
I would say that is correct, but I also want to tune that a little bit because we need to think about two things simultaneously. We need to think about, I'll just put it under the umbrella of good cyber hygiene. We need to think what are the threats we know about and how do we protect against them? That
So
doesn't necessarily exclude
hygiene.
that I have a team of smart people to
Uh,
go back and tell me about the unknown unknowns. There's the known unknowns, there's the known knowns, there's the known unknowns, and then there's the unknown unknowns.
Zone of surprise.
There will always be a surprise. And I usually, when I give a presentation, every so often I'm a jerk to the audience and I ask, who among you is a security professional? And everybody
Shocking
raises
you
their
to hear
hand.
that.
And I go, you're all failures. And they're like, and everybody's like, I'm a failure. I go, yeah, because the actual dictionary of definition of security is being free from risk. And you're never free from risk. And I think a lot of CISOs set themselves up for failures by not describing themselves as a risk manager that says, look, I am going to do the best I can with what you give me to the
Oh,
best of my ability,
I'm
but
going to
there will
stop
be
you for a
something
second.
I can't.
I'm going to stop you for a second. So we agree on threat, whether it's routine or something that's in the future we should be paying attention to. Then it's a question of the right data. So in what you're saying, so I'm just trying to lead the horse a little bit to water,
Right.
is that you look for the data that's going to back up the threat analysis on the threat you're looking at. So 1 to 2, that's right, correct?
Yes, you look at what the known knowns and the known unknowns, and
Perfect.
you have to account for that.
And you can align this, I would assume, and I'm sure you're all going to want to jump in a second on this, to frameworks like NIST 2.0 and everything else that's a buzzword today from the NIST and the compliance world. Everybody on the same page there? Okay, then
Yep.
I'm going to ask the hard question in the room. I'm, as you all know, on boards. My board hat on, I'm not going to care what NIST 2.0 is or what the threat of the future is unless it's going to impact my stock by 5%. And it's great that the lights are on, but I would expect you to have the lights on. You're my risk team. That's your job. So what I want to understand is if I'm going to do this, as Cody, you put it, somewhat difficult fundamental shift from qualitative to quantitative, and I'm going to take my non-cyber hat and put it to the, or my cyber hat, put it to the side, non-cyber hat on, looking from business perspective. What's the ROI on this? Like, how do we measure ROI for quantitative threat exposure management? What do we do, guys? What is the ROI on this?
Well,
Don't
my
everyone
my
answer at once. Ira,
my
I know
yeah,
you can.
My tongue-in-cheek answer to that is you can't possibly know unless you're doing quantitative risk analysis. So otherwise, you're just saying my ROI is I went from a 5
So
to a 3.
imagine, hold on, I'm going to stop you right there. Imagine saying to a board member, you can't possibly know unless you're doing it. Okay, let's just start there. Let's back that answer up and try that one again. Because anyone who says that to me on with my board hat on, I'm going to chew up and spit out. So let's try that one again.
Oh, I'm speaking more to the security professional in this case who's trying to figure out how to make that right case. However, in this case, with speaking to the boards, I think the crutch for a lot of security teams is to back it up to that framework, like you said, and say, well, look, in Identify, we're here now. Or tell whatever the story is, put a maturity flavor on it, and say that that's our ROI, or paint it that way. And for the security professional, that's just not effective. I think, Kate, as you're very astutely calling out, that's not really telling a story. From the ROI perspective, when we're talking about how is this effort adding ROI to the business, the fact that you can even turn something like a vulnerability finding and then tie that back into a picture of not only just likelihood for a more tactical thing, saying this is the likelihood of an event, but given that event, here's now the potential exposure that we have. The next step beyond that, and this is kind of like almost the next step in quantitative maturity, is to then say, how do we reduce that exposure? You have to couple this with that follow-up piece. You can't just bring a bunch of problems to a board. You can't bring a bunch of problems to anybody without recommending a solution. So doing that second phase of the assessment, which is what is the mitigation or the control plan that I'm putting in place? How much is that going to cost, and how much is that going to reduce the exposure? That's how you get to that point of ROI. And that's going to be more meaningful than what I was saying before with, oh, well, our ROI is a 5 to a 3. No, I mean, let's get out of that mode of talking. Let's get out of that mode of thinking. The frameworks are there to support that conversation of maturity, not to tell that ROI story, but really going to that second phase of analysis and looking at your control options or your mitigation options, and then framing this as a risk exposure reduction opportunity. That's the way that we advise our clients.
That's
Yeah, because
I just
just adding
I
on to that,
agree.
it's like I always say that the problem is CISOs get the budgets they deserve, not what they need. And when they walk into a board meeting, what I ideal circumstances is that are you give them and you say, look, here is the budget I'm requesting. For this budget I'm requesting, I'm going to have an exposure reduction or risk reduction of Y amount. So if you give me X, I will return Y as best I can calculate. And here's this. They're like, well, what if this happens? It's like, well, we have to model for that. But, again, we've gone through our models and this is the financial return on investment you're giving. And if there are qualitative issues beyond that that they have a concern about, that's something a smart CISO would walk into the board or work with the board members ahead of time. Because a good CISO does not just walk into a board meeting and say, give me X, I'll return Y. A good CISO works with the individual board members throughout the course of the quarter leading up to the board meetings, finds out what their expectations are, what are the business concerns they have, and then should they say, well, does your thing take into account I'm going into Malaysia? I go to a certain extent, it might, but I still need more data to model. But given the current environment, here's X. You give me X, I'll give you Y. And as opposed to playing a game of what ifs, which boards sometimes do, at least you know what the what ifs are going into there. And simultaneously, a good CISO will obtain their champions to back them up in the board meeting that says, well, I spoke to them about this and we've decided, yes, we're concerned, but we're going to account for that as we move on and gather more data. Now that's the ideal circumstance, but again, life isn't all unicorns and rainbows, and sometimes we might run into a board member like Kate, I guess. But in the ideal world, in the discussion of where we are right now, fortunately or unfortunately, we're taking the conversation to a bare minimum level and raising it here, knowing we need to get it up here. Because previously CISOs had minimum exposure to the board. They didn't get their allotted time at every board meeting. Well, or most see, a lot of CISOs are now getting a lot of time at every board meeting. And we have to account for raising the bar over a period of time. And I'm not in the Pollyanna world, sure, we'd have the answers to everything. In the meantime, we have to start where we are and work our way up with the data we have, the science we can apply, and then playing their what if games as we have to.
Okay, we're going to pause on the Pollyanna comment because, it's a great segue. We've got just a couple minutes left, and I've been watching the questions come in from our audience, and I love this one as we end. So, not your typical explosion of lots of verbiage, Ira. We're going to keep this contained, a minute or less. I'm just giving you that setup so you can think about it while I ask everyone else. The question was, what does the future hold? How do we see this evolving? And so I'm going to answer first is, I actually, thinking about the ROI question and the game of what ifs, I believe that as we think about quantitative threat exposure management, it becomes the ROI. What I mean by that is as boards become more hypercritical around the impact digital risk, cyber, AI, true traditional technology has in the day-to-day function of an operation, understanding and being able to model out in a quantitative way what the impact to the organization is when something goes down. That is the ROI. Because if you don't understand the return on investment of what your KPIs are and the actual direct impact cyber now has to that, that's the ROI. So the future is the game of what ifs becomes the ROI. The ability to take data, translate it into a quantitative way that applies directly to the critical business performance indicators the company is trying to achieve. I think that's where we're headed. And it really truly is that the what if becomes the ROI, and we achieve that through true quantitative threat analysis. What do you guys think? What does the future hold in a minute or less?
I can say that I think it will become the standard in a board meeting, right? Because sitting in a board meeting and still getting this kind of I don't know risk matrix won't be good enough for the future, exactly because what you just said, right? Being able to correlate the specific technical elements that might happen, right? The what if analysis that you have usually in a board meeting to something that is very tangible, saying, hey, you know what? This cybersecurity can cause 5 days of downtime that cost me 100 million. That's something that I can understand. Investing 1 million in order to mitigate this risk might make sense or not, depending on the organization, right? What is the level of investment that is required? But that's at least you have the tools that you need in order to make the relevant decision. I think that being able to do that will be a mandatory requirement coming from board, and I think that maybe future legislation will require that as well, right? At least to have that in a way that is exposed or available to decision makers. That's one. That will lead, of course, then to expansion of this capability throughout the different industry and sizes of organizations, as cyber risk quantification today considered to be something very sophisticated, right? For large organizations, for the Walmarts of the world that Ira mentioned, right? That's something that they think about. They really think that that should be something that is the standard, the de facto standard for different organizations, and I really think that that's going there. So that's my point of view.
Okay, Ira, 1 minute, and then we're going to give our featured guest the last.
Um, I actually don't have much to add on this. I took Gator, but again, I just look at in board meetings. I think anybody, a CISO these days, and unfortunately, they're going in there, and sometimes they're saying, "Well, I'm sorry, things went wrong, but they were a yellow, and I didn't know they'd be a red," type of thing. The whole heat map things I really haven't looked at. In my opinion, frankly, I'm biased because of where I'm located, but I do think that CISOs have to step up their game. There's a lot of talk, especially after the UHG debacle that happened with United Health, about, well, what should be the background of a CISO? And they say, oh, well, should they be technical or should they be business? Because business CISOs understand how to work with the board and all that sort of stuff. And I'm like, you know what? We need CISOs who, frankly, understand the technology and have developed a gut feel for how technology should work and what is the right way to make good gut decisions. But they need to up their game to figure out how to incorporate all the mathematical disciplines, quantified, cyber risk quantification and optimization to really be able to talk better to the board, because right now cybersecurity is not a concern that's been a minimal issue that has just impacted. With the whole unfortunate case of SolarWinds and Tim Brown, it's something that is now attracting national attention, and we need to have our CISOs learn to up their game. And that's how I'll close and pass it to Cody.
Yeah, I think so. We're echoing all of that. We're at a critical moment right now in cybersecurity risk management, and that's a point converging where we have the people, we have the need, we have the tools, and the data are all coming together to actually make this easier. So, where do I think this is going? Risk quantification is getting easier. We have more capability to do it. We have more use cases. We have good examples. We have better data, and that's improving over time, year by year. More lessons learned, more documentation about what's happening in the world, how we can use that data, and then being filtered into relevant frameworks that can help with the quantitative process. So it's getting easier. Second component is that it's becoming more operational. So what I mean by that is CRQ is not just this nice to have little calculator. Quantitative threat exposure management is not just that nice little, like, tell me this one detail about something. These are platform technologies that you can embed into your organization on top of your tech stack to take advantage of the outputs of those other tools to give you meaningful data to make decisions on. And that's the whole point of risk management, whether or not you're improving the ability to make cost-effective decisions for your environment. So I think that's where we're going. It's a really exciting time.
Awesome. I want to take the time to thank all of our amazing expert panelists today. And I hope for the audience that you really got a good understanding of, one, what is quantitative threat exposure management? Why should it be something we pay attention to as we continue to have a closer link with the board? And really focus on what can we be doing differently to foster more trust and transparency as we think about threats. Until next time, I'm Kate Keene. Have a great day. Cheers.